The heavy oak door, the one Arthur had sanded and stained by hand 40 years ago, didn't just slam, it vibrated with a finality that rattled the fillings in Martha's teeth, a sound that seemed to sever the timeline of her life into before and after, leaving her standing on the sleet-slicked porch of the home she had purchased in 1982, clutching nothing but a plastic grocery bag filled with her heart medication and a framed photograph of a dog that had been dead for a decade. The cold bite of the November wind in Ohio wasn't nearly as freezing as the look in David's eyes. Her own son, the boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged on this very porch, who was now watching her from the warmth of the bay window, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone that refused to acknowledge the shivering woman on the other side of the glass. The sheriff, a man named Miller who had gone to high school with David and couldn't even look Martha in the eye, cleared his throat awkwardly, his hand hovering near his belt as if he might need a weapon to handle a 72-year-old retired librarian whose only crime was signing a power of attorney she hadn't fully understood 3 years ago. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Higgins," Miller mumbled, his breath misting in the gray air, "but the eviction notice was served 30 days ago, and David, well, the owner has the right to secure the property." The owner? The word hung in the air like toxic smoke, choking her, because she had paid the mortgage on this house for 30 years. She had planted the hydrangeas that were now brown and withered against the foundation, and she had scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled. But on paper, that treacherous, shifting landscape of legal paper, it was David's house now, transferred in a moment of vulnerability after Arthur's funeral, when grief had been a heavy blanket blinding her to the sharp edges of her son's greed. Martha didn't scream, and she didn't cry, not yet, because the shock was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, keeping the hysteria contained in a tight, painful ball. But as she turned away from the house, her fingers brushed the inside pocket of her thin wool coat, feeling the cold, jagged edge of the single iron key she had swiped from the master hook in the mudroom just seconds before the sheriff had escorted her out. It wasn't the key to the front door. David had changed those locks an hour ago, a locksmith's van still idling in the driveway like a vulture waiting for a carcass. And it wasn't the key to the terrified Toyota Corolla sitting at the curb, which was packed with the few clothes she had managed to salvage. No, this key was heavy, old-fashioned, with a distinct clover-shaped bow, a key that David had forgotten existed, or perhaps thought was long lost, a key that opened the only thing in that house that truly mattered. And as the freezing rain began to pelt her face, mixing with the tears she finally allowed to fall, Martha thought, "You can have the walls, David, but you cannot have the soul of this family." She walked toward her car, her legs feeling like lead, conscious of the neighbor's curtains twitching, the silent judgment of a street she had lived on for nearly half a century. But she didn't look back at the window where her son stood. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break, because she knew something he didn't, something that would turn this victory of his into ashes in his mouth, though the realization of how she would survive the night was a terrifying abyss she wasn't ready to face. The engine of the Corolla coughed before turning over, a sound of mechanical exhaustion that mirrored her own. And as she pulled away from the curb, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror, the house where she had hung Christmas stockings, where she had nursed Arthur through his final months, where she had thought she would die in her sleep, a sharp, piercing panic spiked in her gut, forcing her to pull over 3 streets away, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't grip the steering wheel. Where does a woman go when the world decides she is expired? She checked her wallet, $42 in cash, and a debit card connected to a checking account that David had drained last week from maintenance costs, leaving her with a balance that wouldn't cover a night at the Holiday Inn, let alone a deposit on a rental. She drove aimlessly for hours, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers measuring the time, until the sky turned a bruised purple and the streetlights flickered on, guiding her toward the only place she could afford, the Starlight Motor Lodge on the edge of town, a place where the neon sign buzzed with a dying R and the clientele paid by the hour. The clerk, a young woman with neon pink hair and tired eyes, looked at Martha, a grandmother in a church coat clutching a handbag like a shield, and didn't ask for ID, just slid a key across the scratched plexiglass and murmured, "Room 104, around back. Try not to park under the flickering light. It makes the junkies nervous." Martha took the key, the metallic taste of humiliation filling her mouth. But as she sat on the sagging mattress of room 104, listening to a domestic argument through the paper-thin walls, she reached into her pocket again and pulled out the iron key, holding it up to the dim light of the bedside lamp. This wasn't just a piece of metal. It was Arthur's insurance policy, his final whispered secret. 3 years ago, right after the funeral, David and his wife Jessica, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, had arrived with casseroles and contracts, speaking in soft, soothing voices about protecting the asset and simplifying the estate, words that sounded like help but felt like handcuffs. Martha, blinded by the fog of widowhood, had signed the deed over to David, retaining only a life estate clause that was supposed to let her live there until she died. But she hadn't read the fine print of the second document, the one buried in a stack of insurance forms, which voided the life estate if the property required critical structural repairs deemed unsafe for habitation. It was a loophole, a trap. David had hired a crooked inspector last month who claimed the foundation was sinking. A lie. The house was built on bedrock, but it was enough for the court to grant the eviction for her safety, a twisted mockery of care that left her homeless while David prepared to bulldoze the garden and flip the property for a cool $500,000. But he had forgotten the wall safe in the basement, the one hidden behind the false breaker panel. He knew the safe existed, of course. David had been obsessing over that safe since he was a teenager, convinced Arthur kept gold coins or cash in it. But he didn't have the combination, and he didn't have the key that engaged the tumblers before the dial could even be spun. Arthur was a master locksmith before he retired, and he had built that safe to be uncrackable by conventional means. If you tried to drill it, a glass vial of ink would shatter inside, destroying the documents, and if you tried to torch it, the heat-sensitive lining would fuse the door shut forever. David thought the house was the treasure. The real treasure was inside that steel box. And as Martha lay down on the motel bed, wrapping her coat around her legs because the heater smelled like burning hair, she remembered Arthur's voice. "Marty, if the world ever goes sideways, the answer is in the safe, but you don't open it unless you have to, because once you do, there's no going back." Martha slept fitfully, waking every 20 minutes to the sounds of sirens or shouting, her mind replaying the eviction, the way David had looked at his watch while she packed, the way Jessica had smirked while supervising the movers to make sure Martha didn't take any of the fixtures, which apparently included the antique chandelier Martha's mother had brought over from Italy. Morning brought a gray, relentless light and a stiffness in her joints that made walking difficult. But Martha forced herself up, washing her face with cold water in the stained sink. She had to survive. She couldn't crumble, because if she crumbled, David won, and the lesson he needed to learn wouldn't be taught. She drove to a diner she used to visit with Arthur, ordering a cup of tea and dry toast, counting out her coins with trembling fingers. The waitress, a woman named Betty who had served them for 20 years, paused as she poured the water. "Where's Mr. Arthur's ghost today, honey? And why do you look like you slept in your clothes?" Betty asked, her voice rough but kind. Martha hesitated, the shame threatening to silence her. But then she looked at Betty's name tag and realized that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "My son took the house, Betty. I'm at the Starlight." The crash of the coffee pot hitting the saucer was the only reaction Betty gave before she slid into the booth opposite Martha, ignoring the customers waiting at the counter. "That boy? The one who drives the fancy German car and never tips? He put you out?" Martha nodded, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. Betty didn't offer empty platitudes. She reached into her apron, pulled out a notepad, and scribbled a number. "My cousin runs a boarding house for seniors. It's not the Ritz, but it's clean, it's safe, and she needs help in the kitchen. You can peel potatoes, right?" It wasn't charity, it was a lifeline, and Martha grabbed it with both hands. For the next 2 weeks, Martha lived a life she never recognized as her own, sleeping in a small lavender-scented room at the boarding house, waking at 5 a.m. to prep vegetables, her hands smelling of onions and bleach, finding a strange rhythmic comfort in the work. She didn't call David. She turned off her phone. She vanished from his world, becoming a ghost in the machinery of the city. But while she peeled potatoes, she waited. She knew the timeline. David would need 2 weeks to clear the house, perform the repairs, and get the title company ready for the sale. The micro hook of anticipation kept her awake at night. When will he find it? When will he realize? It happened on a Tuesday, 17 days after the eviction. Martha was in the kitchen, deep in thought, when the landline in the hallway rang. The boarding house owner, a stern but fair woman named Sarah, called out, "Martha, there's a man on the phone. Sounds like he's having a heart attack. Says he's your son." Martha wiped her hands on her apron, her pulse quickening, but she didn't run. She walked slowly to the phone, picking up the receiver with a steady hand. "Hello, David." The voice on the other end was high-pitched, manic, stripped of the arrogant baritone he had used on eviction day. "Mom, where are you? I've been calling your cell for days. The police said you were missing." Martha leaned against the wall.